to be able to look off your right wing and see Iran and know that at the moment they, would love nothing more than, to take out some sort of retaliatory action against the US. It didn't matter if you're civilian or military. It's a little bit unnerving.
In flying, I think everybody more or less falls into two camps. Camp number 1, those that are there for the adventure. And camp 2, those who aren't. Some people crave a little uncertainty, and the others, well, they just want to use their OCD to avoid anything of the sort, right? Well, I'm a gray area person usually. I'm not really a black and whiter. Usually I think the truth about most things lies somewhere in the middle, but of course, with nuance. Extreme polarity isn't where I usually live, but as far as flying is concerned, well, I definitely fall into the avoids adventure camp. And don't get me wrong, I love to go places and see friends and do it in a single engine turboprop whenever I can, so, don't think I'm boring. But I just really don't crave situations where the outcome's more than a little uncertain. Like times when I'd have to break out those superhuman pilot skills we all think we have to save the day. Because my subconscious in a situation like that's going to tell me that, well, I shouldn't have been there in the first place. But don't for even a second think that I don't respect the heck out of those people who are really willing to be out there on the edge and to do those things that people like me would never think of. And even more respect to those who will share those experiences with us so that we can all learn from them and get the heck out of our little comfort bubbles and, really live. Or, at least feel like it for an hour or so. And that's the best part of doing what I do, because I get to do exactly that and then bring it to you, wherever you are, in the hangar, in the car, doing the dishes, whatever. So today on the show, that's exactly what we're going to do. Don't go away. Anyway, you ready to do this?
I guess.
Do you sound... Okay, so is that what you say right before you go on a huge... Like you're about to fly to India and you're going to pick up a sketchy King Air and you're going to fly it back over the course of 2 weeks? Is that the thought you have in your head, or are you just like, let's get this?
It's pretty much, this is probably as good as it's going to get, so let's just get this bird in the air and go. So figure it out along the way.
I love it. And this is the voice of Deanna Wallace, who I'm going to let her explain her whole trip here, but she has some good stories that she's about to share with us, from not just instructing in turboprop aircraft, but how she got here and what she does with that now, and ultimately culminating in taking adventures that I think probably at least half of us might just think the better of. So Deanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I don't even know where to start with you. You have so much great stuff to talk about, but let's just give people what you do right this second. What are you up to today?
Okay, so right this second, I would say, primarily my job is as a flight instructor. And I'm not one who ever thought they would be a career flight instructor, but here I am. But, it's evolved from primary rating type instruction to mostly insurance required instruction for higher performance aircraft, single engine turboprops, King Airs, that type of thing. And then in addition to that, I fly Part 91 managed aircraft and ferry flights.
Okay. Well, that last little part there where you kind of said, oh, and I also do ferry flights. That's where all the fun is, though. Okay. And we're going to get there in just a minute. Absolutely. But
maybe you haven't been with some of my students.
Well, that's true. That's true. Well, let's back it way back up then, because that was a really nice way of just unlocking this crazy box of experiences that you have on the daily. So you work for our mutual friend, Joe Casey, right?
Yes, I do. I work for Joe Casey at Casey Aviation in Jacksonville, Texas.
Okay. And what do they specialize in?
Specialize in PA-46 instruction. So we provide insurance-required initial and recurrent training for all the PA-46 models, both piston and turbine, like the Mirage, Meridian, M600, Jet Prop, all of those airframes.
For sure. And for anybody who wants to go back and listen to what Joe does, episode 48 would be where you can check that out. But for somebody who's going to make their career instructing in turboprops, I think that's going to come with a really unique set of not just circumstances, but you're instructing owner operators that are transitioning from piston engine aircraft into turbines. What is that like?
We see owner pilots that range from, you know, most of them have careers outside of aviation and just use the aircraft for business in conjunction with business or personal use. And then, we get our share of professional pilots that this is their desired personal aircraft of choice. So we've seen quite a few airline pilots come through with them, or those that are flying them for some of the owners. So we get quite a mix of pilot experience levels and whatnot. It really keeps it interesting.
How often, I just have to ask, do you just tell someone, hey, you know what, this is not for you. I don't think you can handle this.
Oh, those are words I have a very difficult time saying. I think anybody can handle this with enough instruction. So, most of the time it's not a this isn't for you. It's a I think we need to spend more time together, to get them to that point. It's rare that you come across someone that truly just isn't going to get it, or rare that I do anyway.
Sure. I mean, how do those conversations usually go? Not that there's a lot of them, but I mean, do people usually, I mean, do they get angry or do they sort of already, I mean, I would assume they probably already know that.
I think somewhere in the back of their minds, they typically realize when they're substandard on certain things and need additional instruction and training, But of course, you mix that with your typical pilot personality that's resistant to negative feedback or constructive criticism or whatever you want to call it. Doesn't like being told they need more help. It can get interesting, but most of the time, I found that most people take it in stride because at the end of the day, they're still waiting on my signature in their logbook to legally fly their aircraft, or to fly their aircraft insured, I should say.
Exactly. I've only told two people in my entire CFI career that that spiel, like, hey, you know what, maybe you should try a hobby that's two dimensional, you know?
Right, right. And I've had some real challenging cases. I've had everything from, in some primary training, combined dyslexia with ADD and a few other things. I mean, sometimes again, it just takes additional time. And, sometimes you got to tell them, hey, you really shouldn't be flying in the clouds alone. But I've found presented the right way, most pilots are receptive to good feedback, you know, not just negative because I'm tired of dealing with them.
Sure. Well, let's talk about you flying alone in the clouds then. And before we get into all the crazy adventures that you've had recently, we need to know how this all started. So you find yourself here in the now doing this, but what possessed you to even sit at the controls in the first place?
Well, so when I was 15, my mother and her husband died in a plane crash, in which she was the pilot in command. It was a clear cut pilot error, after the NTSB report came out, and as sudden and traumatizing as you think it would be for a teenager. I just lost a role model. She was only 36 years old at the time, and it was just entering the years where all major milestones occur. Just before you start driving, and you have high school and college graduations, and marriage, kids, all that stuff. And so, I thought a lot over the years about what she missed and what I missed by not having her around. But one of the things she did right was to lead by example. And I mean, the woman appeared absolutely fearless in everything she did and instilled the same sense of confidence in me that I could do basically anything I decided to do. And she had made the statement once, I don't even recall what age I was, old enough to remember, that any daughter of hers would be able to drive anything on land, air, and the water. And by golly, I've tried my hardest to make that statement a reality over the years and have shied away from very few opportunities offered to try something new because I just like learning and trying new things. Anyway, after her death, life was complete chaos for a while everyone figured out what their own coping mechanisms were. And, for some in my family, it was completely swearing off air travel, and they have to this day, and that was 25 years ago. For others, it was, self imposed survivor's guilt. But for me, it was really just that intense desire to find out what went wrong. And when the NTSB report came out, I read and reread it probably hundreds of times, but only marginally comprehending the terms and nuances of what I was reading. So as soon as I turned 17, I went to the local airport and signed up for flying lessons. I didn't tell my family. I was afraid at the time I would be greeted with an immediate no, as we were only a year and a half removed from my mom's death. So I opted for the ask forgiveness, not permission tactic. But what I didn't expect in my search for, understanding why that happened to her, was to absolutely fall in love with aviation. I mean, there was nothing better than being in the air, controlling an aircraft, and learning to master that new environment and skill. So, still trying to do that 23 years later. But that's how it all started. Yeah. Before my first solo, I let my family know what I'd been up to, and they were thankfully quite supportive of, by that point, of what I was doing, and have supported me along my career path in the many branches it has taken. Um, and it led to just that general love for aviation and a fascination with really human factors and why people do what they do and what leads to accidents. So, my aviation career has always had that human factor emphasis on it, which I think is why I've stayed in the instructional world for so long, because I really just like understanding, you know, what little things lead to accidents and how to prevent those.
Well, that is, I couldn't be happier that you just shared that story that way. That's beautiful because just the way that that could have gone versus the way that you chose to go with it actually speaks to me in a really personal way, because a similar thing actually happened to me. And since you're new to the podcast, I'll kind of tell you the quick version of the story. But my mother and I were actually almost killed in a plane crash too. And it was when I was just turned 10, and I'd already been interested in aviation, but that experience cemented it for me, just like you, that number one, I wanted to figure out how that could happen. And number two, I want to make sure that never happens again. And to a similar degree, I love instruction because I love to mold people in a way that shies them away from those tendencies or the things that make that happen.
Right.
And not only that, but I've been fascinated as well with accident investigations and the way aircraft are made and the way systems work together, and all those things just that come together and ultimately can culminate in a successful flight or a dangerous or possibly fatal flight. But yeah, that's like you said, that the coping mechanisms can kind of go either way. It's either no, we're never flying an airplane again, the end, forget it.
Right.
Or you can go the other way and accept it and really make it your passion to commit to aviation, to give back, to contribute to it, to prevent that from happening to other people.
Right. And I think that's so important for instructors to do. You find so many instructors out there that are using it as a tool to move on, that those who really want to impart impart that safety and knowledge and experience gained through years of flying with people are so important to get the word out there, and a part of the system.
Yeah. Well, before we depart this topic here, just one more question is, what made your mother pick up flying in the first place herself back in the day before you guys? I mean, how did it become a reality in her life?
Oh, sure. So my grandfather, her father, was also a private pilot, multi-rated. Neither one of them had an instrument rating, but though both were private pilot and multi-rated. And when she was 16, she started lessons, got her license. I don't remember if the age was the same back then, but I'm going to assume around 17. And she started flying, just local people around, but because of my grandfather. So she started flying there for a while. volunteer to fly prisoners home on those who had certain leave requirements and stuff, or I don't know what the right word is there, but there were, prisoners that were allowed to go home or for weekend visits and stuff. And she would volunteer to fly them home and back at the end of their leave, however that worked. But yeah, no, I mean, she started around the same age I did, just due to her father also being in aviation.
So you really come from a long line of aviators then, don't you?
I do. He unfortunately quit flying about the time I was born, so I never really got any experience with him in the plane. But, growing up, my mom used to drag us all over the place and various aircraft that she had, the most recent being a Piper Seneca, to work related trips and short vacations and things like that.
Wow. Okay. So you got your certificates and ratings and you said, "Hey, I'm gonna go be a CFI." What happened in the interim between that and now being a pilot at Casey Aviation?
Well, actually, I got all my ratings and CFI. So I went through Auburn University's aviation program. Left there with a degree in aviation management and all my ratings through my MEI. And like most people going through a program like that, thought I'm going to be a go be an airline pilot. And so at the ripe age of, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, before a lot of the current restrictions were in place. So at the ripe age of 21, I was with a whopping, I don't remember, 700 hours maybe in my logbook. I was hired on with a regional airline as a first officer and an ATR. And I was there all of 3 months before 9/11 happened. And so, just like COVID hitting now, and the unexpected decline in air travel and furloughs, same thing then. Everyone was the system got an immediate shock to the system, and thousands furloughed, and I was one of those, and fell back on instructing as my interim waiting on the recall type thing. And while I was doing that, I met a gentleman who asked me to fly right seat with him in a King Air. And I found I just loved the corporate side of things, corporate aviation, which I'd never really been exposed to through my training and along the university path. And so, when it came time to be recalled, when they called back, I declined. I really liked exploring the general aviation side of things. I had realized in that time how much I enjoyed instructing and flying the smaller aircraft with varied people in the back, and it was a lot of fun,
But not fun enough.
but not fun enough. Yeah, so eventually I moved to, through the course of marriage and kids and job changes, I ended up in East Texas and met Joe Casey through, he did an initial checkout for me in a Piston Malibu for a local based client. And then eventually I started sending, when he got designated examiner status, I started sending students to him for check rides. And then when he became a little bit overwhelmed on his schedule between all the training he was doing and managing a few King Airs, he called and he's, said, "Hey, can you come work for me? I need help." And so that's how I really entered Joe Casey's world and got into the PA 46 instruction, and that's evolved into, he's a King Air 300 examiner, so I also give instruction in the King Air series, and got into the ferry flying.
Yeah, ferry flying. So I think there are two groups of people in the world: those who think that'd be the coolest job ever, and those who think that that would be the worst job ever. And I've done a little bit of it myself, and it was pretty benign. Newer airplanes. I picked up new Cessnas from the factory back when I was in sales, and I had to move airplanes around from time to time, a couple states over. I'm in California, so sometimes we had to go up to NorCal or out to Arizona or Colorado or Utah, things like that. But not too awful. But when you say ferrying, you're not talking about just moving some airplanes around. You're talking about worldwide aircraft recovery. And that's probably one of the biggest adventures I've ever heard of. And when Joe was on the show, he obviously talked about that to some degree and how he does it. But when I saw you on In the Hangar with Christy Wong, I couldn't believe the story you were telling about one of the recent trips you've had. And there's no way you're not going to tell that story on this show today.
Okay.
So I want to know how one finds themselves flying over unfriendly nations, unfriendly waters, in a relatively unfriendly airplane halfway across the world by themselves.
Sure. So, ferry flying to international ferry flying had always been a sort of it's sort of aviation professional goal bucket list item of mine. And, I never expected to be doing it to the extent I am. I just wanted to, see some new places and some new routes and see how it went. And so, but I found it's a very difficult market to break into. And that's where, honestly, I just lucked up by going to work for Joe because he was already involved in that market. And I, gosh, I just, I won't say pitched a fit, but every time I had a chance to voice my desire to go on a ferry flight for that first year working for him, he'd nod his head and, tell me when one comes up, we'd go or whatever. But he went to work. He's like, he told me, and Joe has a lot of international ferry experience, but he told me, he said, there's a lot you could learn from people who have been doing it longer than I have. And one of the one of the first things he did was make a call to a lady named Margaret Waltz, who, earned the nickname Queen of the Atlantic, rightly so, as she's approaching 900 North Atlantic crossings over decades of flying, and asked if I could fly with her on trips. And she didn't know me, of course, and didn't really have anything available. So the next one that came up was a trip Joe had taken a King Air from North Dakota to India. And so that was my introduction to it. I took that trip, and gosh, what a doozy. I mean, we covered multiple continents and 12 countries and 6 days. I mean, I saw a little bit of everything. It was a little bit overwhelming at first. It wasn't just a easy, well, not that anything's easy, but, it wasn't as simple, let's take this over to England or the UK and drop it off. I mean, it was very geographically and ATC varied. And anyway, so right after that, Margaret actually called. She had a contract to move a King Air, and she wasn't current to fly them at the time. And so she asked if Joe would fly with her. And he's like, I can't, but I know someone who can. And so he sent me on this trip with Margaret. And I learned more in the 3 days it took us to deliver this King Air to France than I think I've ever learned about aviation and international travel. I mean, it was just a fantastic experience. Right after that was to be my get kicked out of the nest moment, kind of. Joe and I were supposed to go pick up two King Airs from India and bring them back to the United States. We got diverted. They weren't ready when we got halfway across. We got diverted to Austria and brought a smaller piston twin back across. But after that, only one of the aircraft was ready, and Joe's like, you've got this. I'm like, wait, hang on. I've had two very short crossings, one with Joe, three crossings. I am not ready to go to India and pick up an airplane. He's like, sure you are, go get it. And so there we go, just essentially I had some fantastic mentoring and some valuable instruction in three legs, and then or three trips, and then got kicked out of the nest and said go do it.
So basically, a trip with Margaret, a trip with Joe, and pat on the back and go get him, Slugger. I mean, that's
Go get them. That's it.
wow. All right, so there you are. You find yourself in India, and I'm guessing that's probably the first time there. And you walk out to this King Air, the sight unseen that now you've got to spend the next week and a half with, trying to fly it back to the United States. What did that thing look like?
like it had been sitting in India for 6 months on a ramp. I was cleaning I was cleaning nest out of the nose wheel well, and it's one of the things you just like anything that comes out of maintenance or that's been sitting anywhere for too long. You do your best pre-flights then. So walking around and just looking at this thing that's been covered in Indian dust and not had a bath in over half a year, and pulling a nest. Thankfully, there was no critter associated with the nest out of the nose wheel gear, and thinking, "Oh my goodness, what am I climbing into?" But it turned out I actually had two King Airs back to back, one in December and one in January, both coming back from India, a 200 model and then a C90 model. And two very different experiences. The 200 was the first one, and coming back in that after the once I got airborne, on the very first leg, that's when you kind of relax and you're like, okay, I've got this. It flies like a king air. And I've just got to make sense of ATC instructions and international procedures, and keep to timelines and all of that. But just getting it off the ground that very first time was probably the most anxiety I've felt in a very long time. Making sure I was climbing into an airworthy aircraft in a foreign country, crossing just so much area of the world that I'd hardly seen. So.
Well, what would have happened if you had gotten there and you're like, this airplane isn't airworthy? I mean, what do? You just stuck in India? You just fly home? Or I mean, what do you do to get it up to par?
Well, the service I was flying for, they're very good about not sending us out in unairworthy aircraft. So had I detected a problem, yeah, I would have squawked it, said this needs to be fixed. If it could have been fixed in a time frame that made sense for me to sit there with it and then fly it, that's what we would have done. If it would have made more sense for them to fly me back to the US and then send me back at a later date, we would have done that. And and that's happened before too. I left Fort Lauderdale in a King Air going to Peru not too long ago, and right after takeoff had multiple failures, avionics failures and gyro failures, and it was a big old mess. Miami Center was, you know, none too pleased with the lack of any heading indication in my aircraft as I entered IMC. It was the stuff that you don't even think can happen. And I flew back and stuck it on the ground, in the best way I could, which was a real interesting mix of, ATC instructions and pulling up a four-flight approach plate for a localizer glide path. The autopilot wasn't working. My number one and two heading indicator had failed. I'm going off a compass. I mean, it was all kinds of a mess, and the kind of thing that just doesn't happen till you get airborne. And I put it on the ground, and we squawked everything, and they set a mechanic to it, and it's going to be a week or 2 weeks, so they sent me home and sent me back for it when it was ready.
All right. All right, let's go back to India.
Okay.
And here you are about to blast off on what does it take to get that thing back? Like 10 days?
Yeah, about that. It took about six and a half days in the 200. Took 8 or 9 days in the 90. It's a long way across there.
So who plans a flight like that? Because I mean, not just in terms of route and weather and things like that, but I mean in terms of customs and all the permits you have to get. Because it's not just like in the U.S. where you just take off and land at a public use airport in that part of the world. And not only that, but I mean you got to have a hotel to stay in and food to eat and things like that. Who takes care of all that?
Right. In these cases, the company that hired me to fly the aircraft is a handling service that just finds appropriate crew, but they handled all the overflight permits and permitting and customs, and they sent me routes in advance for me to look over and approve, and performance logs and things like that. And once I was comfortable with everything, they filed the flight plans and filed any amendments needed and really took the paperwork work part off my hands so that I could just concentrate on flying the plane, which was fantastic for those first few times, especially when, I've already got so many new things to learn.
So, you have constant communication with them one way or another, right? Or how do you reach them if you need to change something?
Um, Most of the time, we communicate through email, text, phone calls on the ground, pre and post flight. I carry with me personally a Garmin InReach, which allows me some in flight texting capabilities as well. So if I encounter any problems en route or think I'm going to have problems at a destination somewhere, I can at least give them a heads up that something's going to happen. And they kinda get ahead of me in the aircraft and start working it from their end.
So, did you have to use that?
I did. I did. So when I took off out of there in the C-90, has a much shorter fuel range than the 200, and the route that I had taken across the month prior, so that my stops were slightly different. I was leaving from southern India instead of northern. So, the first day I got there, I moved the plane up to Ahmedabad, India, and then I kind of got stuck. We started running numbers, and I needed to get to Oman, and the winds aloft were just so high, and even on extended range we were having trouble. But so we waited it out for a day, and everything kind of, it didn't improve but it didn't get worse. And finally, instead of going all the way to UAE, they said, we think you can get to Oman. How did these numbers look for you? And so I'm looking at the performance numbers, and there wasn't a lot of margin for error, but there were safe reserves, and and they're good about letting me set my own minimums above what's legally required for reserves. And and finally, we looked at it. There were myself and the dispatchers, and we agreed, this leg could be done. But I'd only get from India to Oman, and then I'd do one more leg onto the UAE. Well, I took off out of India, and you got some, I didn't get the routing right across the water, get sent north, and then turned west into Pakistan, and you basically follow the coastline into Pakistan. Um, about half an hour into Pakistan's airspace, I'm following along. I've got flight logs and performance charts, and I know the times I should be making certain waypoints and where my fuel should be and what the winds aloft should be, and it just was not as predicted. And I could see, there was no way I was going to leave Pakistan's coastline on the west side of Karachi, heading down to Oman and cross the Gulf of Oman, and make it all the way across. And so the option was then, do I turn back to India, and we wait out these winds, which it's January, you could be waiting forever, or do I, ask for a diversion to Karachi, Pakistan, which also was not the most appealing option at the time, only because wonderful people there. But the about 4 days prior to my trip, the U.S. had bombed General Soleimani in Iraq, and there was a big stink in the Middle East at the time. Everybody was on edge, and nobody was on real friendly terms with any of their neighbors at that point, especially U.S. registered aircraft. But again, safety of flight issue. I needed fuel. I needed this thing to keep going forward, and so I sent a text to my dispatcher letting them know I was going to request the diversion to Karachi, and then I made my request on the air. And it was interesting. I got asked multiple times, how many souls on board? Well, just one. And they're like, no, how many, how many crew members? Just one. No, how many people are on board? Just one. And it turns out that King Airs are flown by two pilot crews over there all the time. They're not required. They're not allowed to operate single pilot. And so me saying just one soul on board was confusing the controller at the time. But we finally got that. And then they started asking, do I have any cameras on board? Do I have any surveillance equipment? What's the nature of my stop? How long am I going to be on the ground? And lots of questions you wouldn't typically get, moving around the United States or some other areas. Normally you can just say, hey, I need fuel, stop, get your fuel and move on when you please. But it was, and after probably 10 minutes worth of exchanging questions, they finally approved me to stop. And I think at that point, I wasn't sure if I was hoping they were going to approve it or tell me to go back to India, but there it was. And that was the decision that was made.
Wow, yeah, I'm looking at the map right now, and if you went back to India, it doesn't look like it would have been that far. But then, I mean, your only other option would be Iran, which probably wouldn't be great either. But
No.
okay, so I have to ask then, when you find yourself landing, surprise, at Karachi, and a woman by herself gets out of a U.S. registered airplane in Karachi, Pakistan, unannounced, how did they treat you?
Surprisingly well. I was like, there's a few craning necks as I open the door, waiting on the other pilot to get off, and the other pilot never showed up because I was all they had. Um, and when I'm traveling through that region, I try to be as respectful of their customs as I can be. So I had a hair covering, I had a scarf wrapped around my hair, long sleeves, very little skin exposure, those things that would make them uncomfortable in dealing with a female, even one not of their nationality. And they were great actually. I got down. They were quite efficient in the fueling. In some of those places, I'm used to halfway signing my life away just to get access to a bathroom. So I almost stopped, even requesting through the Middle Eastern countries to go into a facility. But I mean, here they readily offered, and then a little nervous when I got in the vehicle with them and got driven, halfway across the airport to, an unknown facility, and lots of guards and security and questions and answers going back and forth in a lane by a ramper who was talking for me, that I didn't understand. But overall it was not a bad stop. It wasn't. They were pleasant to deal with. They were highly curious about me traveling, flying that plane alone, and how far I was going, and all the things you would generally expect from um, any other country or rampers. They were just curious about the plane and its mission. And again, those planes aren't flown single pilot through that region by their own pilots, so they had lots of questions about it being flown single pilot and how I cope with that going through there alone. But it was a pleasant stop, surprisingly. I went. Sorry. So if you uh, I can't believe I'm going to say this. So if you want the most unusual experience from that stop in Pakistan, one of the rampers that was assisting with the aircraft was claimed to be a pilot himself and was telling me about planes he flew. And then before I left, he asked to see my foot.
Oh no.
And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And he goes, your fingers look lovely. I bet your feet look the same. May I see? And I'm like, you want me to take my shoe off? He's like, and your sock. I'm like, no. I mean, uh,
Wow.
no. But it was it was one of those encounters that no maliciousness, odd, an odd thing to hear, had I been in America for sure, but it just highlighted cultural differences and, what yeah, that's by far quite possibly the most unusual request I've ever received on a flight.
That is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, way outside the flying scope of this, but it was I asked my one of my dispatchers later. I'm like, you ever, because he also flies on some of the routes. I'm like, have you ever gotten a request like that? And, got a very firm negative.
Not so much.
Not so much. But I assure you, after 5 hours of being in a boot, the poor man didn't want to see my feet either. But yeah. So after I left there, and again, going back to just the political climate at the time, Middle Eastern tensions were high at the moment, and I was, you know, we were watching everything very closely because there was already rumors starting that the U.S. was going to restrict U.S. registered aircraft through the area and start closing off routes, and um, you know, and so we're watching everything very closely. So I left Pakistan, skipped Oman, and went straight to the UAE and overnighted. And sure enough, the next morning things had started getting shut down. I mean, they were closing off routes. They had not banned U.S. aircraft yet, but I'm pretty sure I had a 9 a.m. local time departure, and I'm fairly certain I was one of the last, if not the last, private U.S. registered aircraft out of that region. I went up the Persian Gulf. Qatar wouldn't let me pass through their airspace, so I was squarely in the middle of the Gulf. Um, until passing Bahrain and went into Saudi Arabia and then headed south from there for my fuel stop in Saudi Arabia. And it was interesting. Everything's available by flight aware and flight trackers all over the place. And someone over in America is watching, sees my tail number tracking through the middle of the Persian Gulf, apparently after the ban had been put in place, which happened while I was already airborne, and starts this person starts emailing people telling them I'm in restricted airspace and I needed to get on the ground. And it was really interesting who all was just randomly uh, tracking that kind of thing. But it was an interesting time to be going through there. To be able to look off your right wing and see Iran and know that at the moment they you know would love nothing more than to take out some sort of retaliatory action against the U.S. It didn't matter if you're civilian or military. It's a little bit unnerving, but at the same time, the controllers and handlers and everyone else in the region seemed, well, like controllers always do, perfectly calm and doing their job, and really really put you at ease going through there.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't want anything to do with that business. But okay, so through Saudi Arabia then, and what was the rest of the route up into Europe?
Left Saudi Arabia, went to Hurghada, Egypt, and overnighted there. The next day, I went on up to another stop on the northern coast of Egypt, and then up across the Mediterranean to Italy. And then from Italy, go to Belgium, Ireland, and then hit the North Atlantic, crossing the Iceland, Greenland, Canada portion.
Hmm. So the weather was nice and warm and good for you in the North Atlantic, right?
Oh, of course it was, in the middle of January, just when the weather's, a nice balmy, I think negative 30 degrees Celsius or so is what it was on the ground in Greenland. It was so stinking cold. It was interesting. As I got through, I got into Ireland late, just at sunset, and they refueled me, and I was going to continue on to Keflavik, Iceland that night. And going in, I knew where the tops were and the clouds, and it was cold. It picked up light icing on the way down, but again, I knew where everything was. Well, by the time I was refueled and out of there, it's full on dark. The additional weather had rain showers had continued to come on into the area. And I picked up a significant amount of icing on the way out of there, on the way to Keflavik, and I kept trying to cycle the boots, and only a little bit would break off. And eventually I was thinking, well, gosh, I just need to get on top, and I knew I was on my way, but it was at a horrible climb rate. And I ended up leveling off a couple thousand feet early because the airplane was just done climbing. And so flying that route across the North Atlantic to Iceland at night with ice hanging on your wings, where I'm on top, I'm not accumulating anymore, but it's so cold, it's not melting, and my boots weren't clearing it. It was definitely an exercise. If you want to talk about someone who was glued to their instruments and performance numbers, and just watching every parameter across there to make sure I had the fuel and reserves and performance numbers I needed to be able to make that at night, it was an interesting experience for sure. And then there were thunderstorms underneath me along the route, and a C90 doesn't get very high. I mean, I was only at 24,000 feet, I think, at the time. But there were thunderstorms underneath me at that altitude. And it, goes back to, we get used to in Texas and the Americas, the tropopause being at a very different altitude than there. It's much lower in the poles. That kind of keeps all that stuff below you. So it was kind of neat watching the lightning show happening below me, crossing that route at night as well.
Is there any point during these flights where you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I shouldn't have done this?
Usually not till after I land somewhere. But no, I've never been at a point where there are a few times where I've considered, I have very definite guidelines. Do I continue on or do I turn back? And once I make the determination that it's safe to continue on, I commit to that and continue on. And no, I've tried very hard over the course of my flying career to not put myself in a position where I was really wishing I was on the ground somewhere.
Okay. And so ultimately you made it back to Texas safe and sound, and then you just go about your day the next day, or do you take some time off after a trip like this?
Well, there's always laundry to be done. Um, yeah, typically when I get back, I take a day typically just to readjust to whatever time zone, to my time zone that I'm in, catch up on laundry, hug the kids, that kind of thing, and before going back to work. But it typically doesn't take more than a day or so to adapt I mean, you're moving across all the other time. You move across 12 different time zones, but you're moving across them so quickly that your body never really adjusts to anything. So I get back that one day, I sleep like a kid who's just come home from summer camp, and has been awake for a week, and then I go back at it the next day.
So we know what you thought about seeing your mother fly. What do your kids think about seeing their mother fly?
Oh gosh. It's they're 13 and 16, which means they're really not thinking about anything other than themselves at the moment. So it's but no, I mean, they think it neither one is showing any real interest in aviation at this point. They think it's kind of cool that mom does that because their friends think it's cool that their mom does that. But otherwise, it's like it's just another mode of transportation from them, and one that they can't decide whether they'd rather take a 12-hour drive to keep their cell service or take a 3-hour flight with me to get there faster. And so, but no, it's a lifestyle they've adapted to quite well. I spend quite a bit of time on the road, and um and they're for their ages quite self-sufficient and have learned to get along great. We use a lot of FaceTime and texting and whatever method of communication they like to use. But yeah, they're pretty cool with it.
Well, feel free to be as vague as you want about this, but I think everybody just really wants to know between companies and the pilots that do this and so on, what kinds of money is changing hands for an adventure like this?
Not as much as you would think. I actually get paid more to hang around locally and instruct honor pilots in their PA 46s than I do to move a plane from India back to the US. But the reward in that kind of flight isn't the money exchanging hands. And again, I see a very small segment of that. I don't see, I'm just the pilot contracted to fly. So, what the overall cost is that somebody's paying for this trip to happen, I don't really know. I don't know. I do know from just a contract pilot perspective, it's in line with most day rates around the United States for typed or untyped aircraft, depending on which one they stick me in. If you're thinking about money, I would never go on one because, again, I can make more staying at home and training people, but the reward is in seeing the new places and challenging myself through the different rules and regulations of all the different countries and hopping in. I love hopping in airplanes I've never seen before and figuring them out as I go. I've seen so many different avionics systems, packages, and different aircraft systems. It's just been, I do it for the personal challenge of it, rather than the money.
Sure. Well, when you were on In the Hangar, Christy called you a baller pilot. Are you a baller pilot?
you know, the funny thing about that was, and Christy, she has one of the most enthusiastic, infectious personalities I've been around in aviation, and she's accomplished a lot in a short time herself. Um, and she started this series called Baller Pilots, where she highlights pilots she thinks have done interesting things with their careers or recreational flight paths, and have a story others might be interested in. But the most interesting thing about the episode she did with me was not my story, but rather the completely inordinate amount of time we spent explaining in the YouTube comment section what the term baller meant. I mean, people just didn't know what it was, and several were offended on my behalf, not realizing in its context it was meant to be complimentary and, hey, she's done, fun things here, check it out. But yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I guess to some people, I'm a baller pilot. I've arrived where they want to be, and and that's fun and exciting. And it took a lot of work to get to where I am, um, but yeah, that was probably the most interesting thing about that whole term was the not the actual story, but the time spent explaining what a baller pilot was.
So what's next for you in aviation, or have you just arrived and here you are?
Um, I don't know. I love, and I always have loved thinking in terms of like 5 year plans, and I've always had some sort of an idea of what I wanted the next thing to be, and a sort of path to get there. And we all know in aviation that's a wavy, up and down, windy path, not a straight line. But at the moment, I'm no longer looking at movement per se, but rather at improving my current craft and instructional techniques, focusing on learning as much as I can about the aircraft I'm regularly teaching in and fly, and how to better impart information to those flying the same aircraft, and a lot of that, as we talked about earlier, is noting the human factor trends that show up in the course of accident analysis and how those can be mitigated by my small reach through instructing. Um, if there's anything else, of course, I want to fly everything out there. What at some point I've got to figure out how a helicopter gets in the air. I don't get them at all, but I'd also love, to devote time to learning more on the maintenance side of things. I like knowing the hows and the whys of how things work and spending time in the maintenance shop, mostly pestering them with questions that, mechanics feel pilots either don't need to know or should already know, and there I am asking. But again, you can only learn so much at a time. So there's always something else I'm trying to learn to improve. But at the moment, no, uh, there's no desire to move. I don't know if you'd call it up or laterally or wherever. I'm not gearing towards the airlines. I like my niche in general aviation. I'm not necessarily looking for the next plane that goes higher and faster and further. I really like yeah, I do. I like where I am and just flying the planes and instructing in them.
So if I have a listener out there somewhere that has a beach starship that they need repoed, how would that person get in touch with you?
Flycasey.com. All my contact information is on the website there. And if someone has a beach starship they want me to come fly, man, have obviously never been in one, but I am their gal. I will have it figured out by the time I'm there at the plane. So I'm definitely not going to shy away from that challenge or climbing into a unique aircraft. But yeah, so I can, of course, I love posting pictures and chronicling some of these pictures on social media. So if anyone's an Instagram user, they can find me, the Girl Pilot, or on Joe Casey's website at flycasey.com.
Camp do you fall into? Let me know. Shoot me an email, brandon@podcastingonaplane.com. Or better yet, you can use your smartphone or the SpeakPipe widget that pops up anytime you visit podcastingonaplane.com to record me something, and who knows, maybe I'll even put it up on the show. And while you're on the website, maybe consider supporting the show too. If you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You'd get episodes early and sometimes other fun stuff too. And if you're not into the recurring thing, you could head over to buymeacoffee.com/Bravo Golf spelled out and do a one-time thing. It takes increments of just $3. And if you want to stay sharp on that mic, make sure to use the affiliate code DELTA at plainenglishsim.com to get 10% off the best smartphone-based ATC radio comm simulator around. There's, of course, a link in the show notes. And as always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes and for listening to this show and passing the word along about this or any of your favorite aviation podcasts to a friend. That's all for now. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.